Postcards from a Dying World, the podcast. For more than a decade, I've reviewed over 1,000 books that are mostly science fiction, horror, and bizarro. This feed will feature bonus audio I have produced over the years, as well as a monthly digest of reviews based on what I've read each month, plus the occasional bonus material about my own fiction. Thanks for listening.
Hello and welcome to Postcards from a Dying World. I am really excited to welcome my guest today, who I have interviewed sort of on YouTube before I had a podcast when I was practicing. So they're out there on the YouTubes. There is a deeper discussion with this man's background, but Maurice Broaddus is somebody I'm really stoked to have on the podcast today because he is one of my favorite writers in general, but he's also from my home state of Indiana. We grew up an hour away from each other. Unfortunately, didn't know each other then, but we do now. And we're, I'm a big fan of his work. So Maurice, welcome to Postcards from a Dying World. It's great to have you.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's funny you say that because often my middle school students refer to me as their practice adult. So I'm comfortable in this space. So.
Right. But so here's the thing. Let's talk about how you, I don't want to go super deep because I want to really get into this book, but how did you get into genre fiction and, growing up in Indianapolis, like where did you get into this stuff from?
Yeah, it's interesting because, it's Indiana. I live in Indianapolis and, we're in the heart of Bible Belt country. And so it's the short answer is church. Let me just start there. Church. I remember treating the story of Noah and the flood as the first post-apocalyptic story I'd been told, and just dealt with it that way. And then I bumped into another Sunday school teacher who sort of pulled me aside and was just like, "Yeah, I think you're one of us." And I'm like, "Well, what does that mean?" And then he showed me his collection of like Star Trek episodes and Doctor Who episodes and all these comic books. And then also in fifth grade, my best friend gave me his comic book collection. And so suddenly I have this stack of books that suddenly sucked me into their world. So yeah, it's been a thing for me.
Well, and growing up in Indiana, I'm sure Sammy Terry played a role in that too, our horror host.
Oh, absolutely. Staying up late, watching Sammy Terry. It's the double whammy. I had the Kung Fu theater at, just after school, and then Sammy Terry at night. So that's a lot of my genre education right there.
Yeah, absolutely. And for those who don't know, Sammy Terry was our horror host in Indiana and is the reason why most of us into genre stuff in Indiana, is a lot of our education was lots of Hammer movies. It's the first time I ever saw Phantasm, for example, was on Sammy Terry. So, but it's a whole other thing to want to transition into writing it. Was there a work or was there a piece of fiction that really made you say I want to do this, I want to be a writer?
There's a couple different encounters. So, I remember the first piece I can clearly remember writing personally was in fifth grade. I wrote this story called The Big Mac Attacker, which was the story of a Big Mac being eaten, told from the point of view of the Big Mac. And so that was me, my first attempt in me writing genre. But the stuff that made me fall in love with it was probably, I'm trying to think if had to be comic books. Guaranteed it was comic books. And I'm gonna say it was either Watchmen, because 1986 was like a big year for me in comic books, because like Dark Knight Returns came out, Watchmen came out. I'd already been reading a lot of Alan Moore's Swamp Thing run, Miracle Man run. Stop me if I get too nerdy. But it's probably
nerd out.
Right, okay, good. It was probably Neil Gaiman's Sandman that made me fall in love with the idea of story, to be honest with you. And so, in fact, I would come back to reread Sandman like the entire run, like every couple years, just to have me just fall in love with the idea of writing and story all over again.
You've gotten to write comics too, right? You've gotten to go full circle on that?
Not quite yet. I've written Black Panther short story,
Okay, so
And
that's what I was thinking of.
yeah,
Right. Yeah.
right. And behind me, I have my complete collection of Black Panther Funko Pops. So there's that. But I've come close. I am almost there.
Right,
Almost there.
right. Well, hey, writing that story is a good start, because
Believe me. Like I have the first appearance of Black Panther somewhere over there, and I'm surrounded by my comic book collection, and so they're like, I'm in my office, 20,000 books, 20,000 comic books surrounding me right now, but one of them is Black Panther's first appearance, and he is my favorite superhero, and the idea that I got to write a short story about him, was all of my geek dreams right there.
right. Now that is really cool. Is there anybody else you would love to write in comics? Like just putting that out there in the world?
Right. So Falcon was one, Cyborg is another, and Mr. Terrific, actually, which is not one that immediately comes to mind for a lot of folks, but yeah, Mr. Terrific is one who I've been intrigued with also.
Yeah, that's awesome. So, but to make that step into writing, the comics were obviously the big influence. What was your first sale, and how long did you suffer like the rest of us before that sale, or did you sell something early?
Well, let me back up, because in high school, that was when I encountered the two high school teachers who really encouraged me to and pushed me into writing. And so the writer I imprinted on then was actually Edgar Allan Poe. And so I had all of these, and I kind of blocked out of my head, because I'm thinking back to all the stuff I wrote back in high school, and there was this real angsty Edgar Allan Poe influence stuff that I was just like, oh man. I mean, it wasn't my voice, but that was who I imprinted on early on, and it took a while before I moved on for Edgar Allan Poe. There was a transition when Edgar Allan Poe, Stephen King, then Neil Gaiman. That was pretty much my trajectory right there. And so in college, because I'd stopped writing for a bit in college, but then I just randomly started picking up some writing classes, and then I picked up an independent writing course, and the professor was like, "Did you research me before you took my class?" And I'm like, "No, I thought we were paired at random." And he was just like, "Yeah, I did my dissertation on Stephen King and Clive Barker." And I'm like, "Oh, then I think I'm where I'm meant to be then." And I remember sitting in his office, and he handed me an issue.
What school was this? Where
this
were
was
you?
So I'm here in town. So it's at IUPUI, Indiana
wow.
University, Purdue University at Indianapolis. And I remember sitting in his office, and he handed me this issue of Cemetery Dance. And he's like, "Now this is the kind of magazine you need to be submitting to. And when you get into a magazine like this, then you know you've made it." And so I graduated. Yeah. Oh, right. Exactly. And so I graduated in '93. But but as part of that class with him, I submitted a story for the Isaac Asimov Award for a short fiction, and I got an honorable mention in that contest. And so that was like my first sort of like shadow taste of publishing. I didn't win it, but I got an honorable mention. So that sort of told me, well, maybe I'm on the right track with this. So so that was '93. '93 was also when I started writing my first novel, and I finished that novel in 2000. And it will never see the light of day. It is a hot mess of a novel, but it was mine. I'm still proud of it.
Part of the process.
It is exactly part of the process. But the other part, because it took me 7 years. I'm still trying to figure out what does it mean to write a novel, right? But along the way, I would write these short stories, because short stories are my first love, and frankly, I need that high of beginning, middle, end, to keep me going while I'm trying to figure out writing this novel. And so this is a long way to go for answer this question. But
no, I'm here for it. So go.
Okay, all right, great. And so this led to me submitting to a magazine called Hoods, HOODZ, Hoods Magazine. It was their inaugural issue, and I submitted to them, and they wrote back, and they were like, "We don't even take fiction, but we're going to take this." And it was this, what was the name of that story? Wages of Sin. daggone, I've done blanked out on my own stories. My first sale. Oh, Soul Food. Wages of Sin was it's an early draft title. It was called Soul Food. And it was about a sin eater. It was a sin eater in the hood type short story. And that was my first sale. Hood's Magazine.
Wow.
I still have the check for $25 around here somewhere.
That's great. But and listen, your short stories are fantastic. Your collection, Voice of Martyrs, was one of my reads of the year that I read it, and it's really a fantastic piece of work. And what's really cool about it is that the stories are really you kind of have the then, now, kind of future like take to it. And one of the things that I really like about the stories is there's a real spiritual edge to them, and which I know is part of your personality. And it's funny, we'll talk about how your personality comes out in Sweep of Stars, because I was referring to my wife. I was talking to my wife about this book, and I was talking about how your personality comes out in the book, and it was funny because she said, I thought you only like hung out with the guy once. And I said, yeah, but I think I learned his personality pretty good that day. And I saw it in this book, and it's one of those things where it's something I really appreciate about your work, is that I feel like I get to know you in reading your work. And you're one of those authors who I feel really comfortable, like, you know, like I know I'm reading Maurice Broaddus' work, because there's certain things, and we'll get into it when we get into the book, but I really like how you put your personality into your work. You don't, a lot of authors are afraid to do that, and I actually love and appreciate that when an author does. So
yeah, it's funny. I literally was just having this conversation an hour ago, because I was at church, and a friend of mine was just like, is it weird that I'm a friend of yours and a fan of yours? And I was telling him, I was like, look, I like that, because I pour so much of myself into my work. You know, like, I want my friends to read it at that certain level and go, no, you're reading me. You were learning me. You're and I want to put that edge out there as part of my voice as a writer.
Yeah, and I think you're one of those authors where if I didn't see the title or the author, I'm gonna figure it out at some point. I'm gonna figure out, like, you know, and it's funny too, because some authors, like, it's in a really strange way, like Brian Evanson, like you're gonna figure out that it's him, but it's not so much his personality, it's his voice. Whereas I think a lot of this is it's both, and I do appreciate that. Now, some of your first like real novels that I remember were was your King Arthur retelling, which is a series of books that Kings of Breton Court,
Knights of Breton
Court. Yeah. And I, you know, that was the first time I read your work, and of course I was interested because it took place in Indianapolis, and I grew up near there, and you know, like, I know what 38th Street means in Indianapolis, right? Just you know, and so certain things like that, it just really spoke to me, and I just really love those books. But can you give folks a nugget about what those books were and what it meant to your career starting off with that series?
Absolutely. So up until that point, I was sort of making my bones as a horror writer. I'd had a few horror novellas published at this point. I think I had like 2 or 3 novellas published at this point, and about, I don't know, 10 or 20 stories published at this point. And so I was writing this coming of age horror novel. At least to my mind, that's what I was writing. I was writing a coming of age horror novel. Because I'd been working with a ministry called Outreach Inc., and it's a ministry for homeless teenagers. And I was doing some writing exercises with them, and I don't know, I'd thrown out this line about being princes and princesses of the streets, and for some reason that image just stuck with me. And so then I started writing, like, what could that look like? And so I started telling the story of King Arthur through the eyes of homeless teenagers and gang members, and it was literally just a writing exercise for me. I was doing like NaNoWriMo that year, so I was like, well, let me just do this as my NaNoWriMo exercise and everything. And like I said, then I went back to my usual routine of writing horror novels and that sort of thing. there was a call for submissions from Angry Robot, and they had said that we were looking for out of the box type books in the vein of Neil Gaiman, and I'm just like, oh wait, that sounds like me. And so I had actually submitted them a different novel, and so I'd sent it in. It was kind of a police procedural investigating the death of a god, or death of a goddess, actually. And
that sounds awesome
publisher, too. Right? And so I'm like, I was right there. So I was like, you couldn't ask for a more Neil Gaiman type book pitch than this. And then the publisher writes back, the editor writes back, and he's like, look, we're never using the phrase in the vein of Neil Gaiman again, because we got like a half dozen police procedurals investigating the death of a god type novels. And so he's like, but I like your writing style. Do you have anything else? And so I pitched him on this book that I was working on. I was like, it's Excalibur meets The Wire. And he was like, if you can make that work, we will buy that book.
Right.
And then we were off and running after that.
Well, yeah, and those books are super entertaining, very, very, very meaningful, great stuff. Was my introduction to your work. That's where I started, and then kind of worked back reading stories and things. And but so and another thing too, like in the collection, one of the cool things is that you have steampunk stories, which you have a steampunk novella, Buffalo Soldier, that's great, which I have reviewed on my site. But you've done the steampunk thing, you've done some science fiction in the collection, so you've touched on all these things. But I think Pimp My Airship too is like a big deal for you, which is it's an early steampunk story for you, right? But it's like kind of like, because it got published in Voices of Martyrs, like it recently won some awards and some things, right? So could you tell people about that story and where that came from?
Yeah, so that came from, so there was well, I mean, in all honesty, it came from a joke on Twitter. I was on Twitter. I didn't know much about the steampunk genre. I knew enough to make exactly one joke on Twitter. And I said, I'm going to write a steampunk story with an all-black cast and call it Pimp My Airship. And that was the whole joke. And I hit send on the tweet, and then a half dozen editors hit me up and said, when you finish that story, send it to us. And I was like, oh crap, I might be onto something. So
right.
So I end up writing this story, and Jason Sizemore ends up with it over at Apex Magazine. And I knew, even as I was writing that story, I was like, this is probably career defining for me in a lot of ways. Because I mean, it came out the year. So I just sold Kingmaker, book 1 of the Knights of Breton Court series. I just sold that one. And then I sold Pimp My Airship, and I was just like, between those two things, I might be moving out of horror into other areas. Right. I just didn't realize just how much that would be. So Pimp My Airship, when it came out, it was like one of the first Black steampunk stories, period. And so then other folks started asking me to write. So I ended up writing, probably a smooth dozen or so short stories in the same universe, same steampunk universe, probably a dozen stories, plus Buffalo Soldier, the novella. I wrote a novelette, Babylon Systems, that came out last year in a magazine of fantasy and science fiction. But then I revisited Pimp My Airship, and I was like, because one of the criticisms of the story was that people were like, well, we liked the story and everything, but we could feel like there was a whole world there that we didn't get to see. And I'm like, well, of course, because they were only paying me for a short story, and then B, I've now written like almost a dozen stories in this world, because there was a whole world there. But I wanted to see if I could specifically turn Pimp My Airship into a novel, and then I did, and it languished in my trunk because, again, I, like with Kingmaker, it's like it was a writing exercise for me that I hadn't intended to publish. But then an opportunity popped up, and I was just like, well, I have this novel just sitting here, and it was with Apex, as a matter of fact, back to Apex, and we were off and running. And then I won the Indiana Authors Award with that novel.
Well, and I think what those stories set in that kind of steampunk universe do also is they show your skill for world building, which Sweep of Stars does too. And we will drill down on that world building in
Okay.
just probably one more question. But the other thing too that you've been doing that people should know about is you've been writing middle grade fiction work, and I think that has a lot to do with your work as a teacher or working with kids. And so I do think it's cool that you're doing that. It may appeal less to my listeners than some of your other work, but and it's funny too, because I have looked at your books, your middle grade books, and I look at them and I realize that these are not for me. They're not written for my age group, but I really respect what you're doing with them.
Yeah.
And think it's really cool. I looked at Usual Suspects, which was really neat. And
you'd be surprised how much adult appeal they have, apparently.
Yeah, and I know that. And they're really, I'm not knocking them. I think that they're really cool.
Yeah, because my goal actually with writing those, I was actually trying to write something that my boys in particular would read, but I was trying to do Walter Mosley for kids. Like, could I nail that? And that's always been the lens I try to write those books through.
Yeah. And look, and I think it's a really cool thing, but like getting into that voice of middle grade fiction, and you're doing it now. You told me right before we got on that you're working on a book for this. Like, what's the different? I mean, how do you look at the writing process for that different? Do you have to like modulate your voice a little bit? I mean, yeah, you must a little bit.
Yeah, but you know what? It's surprisingly little that I do, because people will think that, well, you write middle grade, then you gotta, dumb it down and blah blah blah. And I'm like, no, it's the exact opposite. Because middle schoolers are a sophisticated reading group. Mm-hmm. And they accept no BS. They and they know when people are talking down to them, and so I do not talk down to them in the books. I write fairly complex storylines and characters, which inevitably leads to discussions with my editors about whether or not, like, is this really how a middle schooler would act or behave? And I'm like, oh, trust me, I'm actually toning it down for you with some of their answers.
Right.
So, and language, because apparently I can't write middle school dialogue the way they actually speak in school. So, like, all right, I'll tone that down. But other than that, I make it a point not to change my voice.
Yeah,
because exactly.
And most of us started reading this stuff when we were, how many of us started reading Stephen King when we were in middle school? Yeah.
And that's the thing. I'm like, if I dumb it down, they're just going to go read Stephen King or read, any of these other authors, because, there's stuff that they are looking for. So yes, I definitely don't dumb it down for them.
Yeah, exactly. All right. So let's get into Sweep of Stars. For those who are on YouTube, I'm holding up my pre-ordered copy from Mysterious Galaxies. And I made the mistake. Well, see, because I pre-ordered it like 4 months ahead of time, now they got a bunch of signed copies that you signed at the LA Book Fair. And they told me I could have switched it out for one, but I had dog-eared mine so many times that I was like, all right, I just have to track down Maurice sometime next time I'm in Indiana and get it signed.
Yep. I think I can make that sacrifice.
Yeah. So here's the thing. One of the reasons why I pre-ordered this book is because from the moment you announced I'm doing a space opera trilogy, I was like immediately sold. Maurice is doing a space opera trilogy. I said, okay, I'm in. And holy crap, this is so good. So the basic idea, or tell us like what you pitched and what Tor bought, basically. To start with, because I think that's a part of the story, because they bought the concept before you wrote it, right?
Correct. I remember I was having drinks with the editor, Diana Foe, and she was asking me what I was thinking about writing next, and I talked to her about Pimp My Airship and a couple other things I was working on, but and she's like, oh, what's coming after that? And I was just like, well, I have this one idea about writing, basically, what if my sister and her friends were a military unit out in space exploring the universe? And she was just like, you know what, you get me an outline for that, and we could move forward on a book like that. And I'm like, okay. And I sort of pitched it as well, actually, I hadn't even had the full pitch then yet. That was pretty much the sole idea I had at the time. So then I go back to start working on this outline, but then that whole world building part of me kicks in. So I'm just like, well, what sort of world would send this all-female military unit out into space to do any sort of exploration? And so I started doing this world building. I probably spent, must have been a year easy thinking through this world, and building all the different aspects to it. And so by the time I was done with all the world building, I was just like, man, if I write a book that is just this unit off in space, I'm learning the example from Pimp My Airship, which is people are going to come back and go, there was a whole world there we wanted to see.
Right.
And you didn't let us see it. So I'm like, okay. And so I wrote this outline, and basically there are three main storylines I pitched, and so when I sold it, I've written the 3 sample chapters and sent them the outline, and then said, hey, this is think of it as Black Panther meets Game of Thrones in space. And so the 3 major storylines follow the main community, the intergalactic community known as Muungano. There's we'll just say there's a succession storyline that's involved in that storyline. Then we get to see the military unit exploring the other side of a wormhole, and we have a generational starship that's powered by jazz music that is exploring our universe also. And so it's these 3 main storylines that interweave for Sweep of Stars.
Right. And one of the things that's so amazing about, so you had like these storylines and these things, and so then you had to tie them all together. And I know a lot of the kind of marketing material from the publisher, and a lot of the ways people were selling it was The Expanse meets Black Panther, and I think that's fair as well.
Right.
However,
that's how the pitch evolved. It evolved into Black Panther meets Expanse.
Yeah, and I think it's funny because for me, what I took it as a little bit of Afrofuturist Dune too, because there is the families thing. However, I think the reason why people want to make the Expanse comparison is because it is set in our solar system. Right. So and this Afrofuturist society is throughout the solar system. Yeah. And so it's important, the timeline too, when we get into, and I think it really, now here's the thing, and I said this in my review of the book, there's some people who find Dune too dense and they just like can't go there because, whereas even as when I read Dune in 7th grade, I was just like willing to be like, okay, I don't get some of it, but I'm just going to go with it. I can read that way. And I think for me, there's a way to read Sweep of Stars where you just have to be swept away with it a little bit. However, you put a timeline and a glossary in there, so you don't have to. Right. But the way you read this, there are 2 ways. I didn't refer to the glossary and the timeline that much when I read it because I just let it sweep me a little bit. Okay. Every once in a while, I'd be like, well, I'm not sure who this is. I'd go to it. And then when I told you I had to stop reading in the middle because I had a writing deadline myself. I did go back and read the timeline before I started reading halfway through again after taking 3 days off. Right. And when I did that, I was like, okay, a lot of this makes more sense to me when I'm looking at it. But what's cool about it is that for me, as somebody who's a fan of world building, I really loved this universe and what was going on. So we're going to drill down a little bit on that. I don't think anything is going to be super spoilery, but if anyone really wants to be completely clean on it, know that I'm telling you right now, you want to read Sweep of Stars, you can pause it now, you can come back, because we're going to get really deep into it. You've heard the pitch, you've heard the idea, okay? But I don't think there's anything that's going to ruin the book. But I think also you might get more of it if you read it and come back, because we're going to get into how Maurice created this. So that's just putting that out there for the listeners, that this could be a pause and come back type moment. Now, the novel is set against the backdrop of this African diaspora empire. And I don't want to butcher the pronunciation, but it's the Magano Empire. Am I saying it right?
Look here, because when they came to me about the audiobook, they were like, well, how do you pronounce this? And I'm like, look here, I wrote it. I had no intentions of actually saying any of this out loud, which was how
that happened to me with my Chinese vampire novel. I just like, people were asking me pronunciations, and I'm like, yeah, I'm terrible. Yeah,
right. Like, their words. You figure it out, and then I'll take my cues from you. But I've been going with Mungano. Right.
Okay. Now, so this is set after a post-ecological collapse. Mm-hmm. And what's going on with the timeline that might make things like kind of fudgy and interesting for people is that the way this alternate history works is that some of the people escaped on a generational ship from the African diaspora. So their ship was launched at post-ecological collapse to save part of this community from Africa, and oops, they ended up falling back in time. So while our history is going on, they're building this whole empire on the far side of the moon where they can remain hidden, right? So this is where you can have like this huge, like they've had years to have technological advancement and move themselves throughout, and they set up a city called the Dreaming City on the moon. So this history, were you building this independently when you were doing the outline, like completely, or did some of this come during the writing process of the novel?
I am so glad you asked that question. So one, your comparison earlier, the Afrofuturist Dune thing, I like that idea, because I know that during one of the drafts, I was really feeling my Dune Wheaties at that point. I was just right. Like, oh man, I'm like, oh, and that, because that's when it's at that point I was just like, I want to have a diagram for the governing families. I want to have a timeline. I want to have a glossary. I'm like, at this point, at that point, I was like, really, like, this is it. This is my, because I was like, you don't make it as a genre writer. So you have a book out that has to have a glossary. That's literally where I was at with my thinking as far as that went. But you talked about my collection of Voices of Martyrs. And so that book, is divided into stories that take place in the past, in the present, and in the future. And then as I was revisiting that collection, and then it hit me, because I'd been writing all these other science fiction pieces, and I was just like, man, what if these were all in the same universe?
Yeah.
And then I was just like, wow, so in a lot of ways, the Astro Black trilogy is almost like the unifying work that unifies all the, because like at this point I'd had probably a half dozen stories, half dozen to a dozen, short science fiction short stories that have been published at this point. And I'm like, yeah, this could actually unify all the stories. So let me drill down a bit on that and like see how these independent short stories shape this world. And so as I had approached some of these stories and was putting the pieces together, that was just like, oh man, it's like part of me knew I would one day do this book because all the pieces fit together just naturally. So yeah, so it's like,
so some of these elements you had in stories already thought out, like back in the day, right? Yeah, and some of it sounded familiar to me, and for that reason. And then also it's just smart as a writer, because it gives people a reason who are fans of this book to like go back and get the short story collection.
Right. Well, at this point, like I think like two or three, like one or two of the stories in the collection have impact, and actually have impact for book two. So there's that hint going along. But but I'd also, after post that collection, I'd really, because it like, I'm gotta back up a little bit. When the reviews came out for Voices of the Martyr, that was when that was the first time I'd been called an Afrofuturist, and I had no idea what that even meant at the time. I'm seeing these reviews calling me an Afrofuturist, and I'm like, Afro what now? And so I started leaning into that, started writing some more science fiction pieces, and so like what was that story? Elle is a Spaceship Melody is a novelette I wrote that was published in Beneath Ceaseless Skies, and that was the first time we see the starship that's been powered by jazz music. But then again, like I said, I was like, yeah, I want all of these to be part of this cohesive world. What would it look like to build this cohesive world? What culture would unify all these different aspects of these stories that I'm trying to string together? And yeah, that was the writing challenge of it all.
Right. And so, but the Cold War stalemate in the 2120 with the Oren Gate is kind of like the thing that sets this story in motion.
Yep, that's the jump off point.
Yeah, and then it kind of, and that's where the families kind of start coming together. But now, well, and it's funny that I mentioned this, and then I'm going to double back to the Afrofuturist thing, like which is a really stupid way. Here's this big thing, but I'm going to go back now. But no, not every writer likes being called an Afrofuturist, in that sense. And I know Nadia Korafor has been very clear that she's an African futurist and like saying the difference between it. And that's partially because a lot of her fiction and another one of the best reads of my year this year was her book Noor. And because it's set in Africa, it's like actually in Africa. And I think that's part of the distinction. But so you didn't even know what that thing was, but now that you know what it is, do you feel comfortable with that title with this book? Because from an outsider perspective, I think it makes sense.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a perfect definition for what I'm doing, because I'm centering Black culture, and by Black culture I'm defining that as an African American culture. I'm centering that culture in these stories and speculating about what things could look like for us in the future. And so I am perfectly comfortable with that term.
Yeah. Now, so with this inciting incident and these things that move the story forward, though, we have the Dreaming City that is a place that has existed. And this is a perfect example of where I want to give how world building, where the rubber meets the road, right? So one of the things is when I say that I let the wave go with me and I kind of catch up to things, since you mentioned Indianapolis being the capital of that, which we need to come back to of OEs, like, which is basically the new form of the United Nations. When I'm letting things sweep me along for a little while, I got a little confused of what the Dreaming City was versus the capital, because I'm letting things flow over me. And what I want to talk about, which is interesting about how world building works, is that sometimes as an author, that not everyone's going to be catching everything at the same time, and they're going to be catching back up to things, and they can go back to things. And that's one of the things where the glossary is helpful. But in that sense, you've got a lot of balls that you're juggling as far as creating this world and these things. Like, how much of, so did you made all these charts and glossaries and things before you started?
No.
You were making them as you went.
It actually is a bit of both. So like one of the first things I did was literally that timeline. So I could have it in my head. What is it? And actually the timeline I have is different from the one that's in the book, because the one that I have actually marks out the stories that had been published, where they occurred in that timeline. So I'd have that part of it straight in my head too.
So you had to make a separate for the book timeline.
Yep. Right, exactly.
Makes sense.
And so like originally I was this book was supposed to take place 1,000 years from now. And then as a world building issue, I was just like, yeah, I suck at technology. And so all the tech that I'm imagining, I'm betting it won't be here in 1,000 years. It'll probably be here in 100+ years. just from my own imagining. So it was like, well, now I'm about to compress my timeline down into something. Now, what does it look like? So that was an issue. But here's the other piece, and I keep come back to the short stories aspect of this, is as I'm building this world, there are whole elements and pieces even in that timeline that you mentioned, that I'm like, not necessarily thought out real well in my head. It's like I have the date there, but I'm like, what does that even mean? And so then I'll write a whole short story to flesh out that idea, or flesh out that period of time, so it would be more concrete in my head, so I could keep writing the novel. Mm-hmm. And so even in the process of writing this novel of just Sweep of Stars, like I said, I'm trying to unify 6 stories or so that had already been published, but I end up writing another probably 10 short stories in this world so I can have it solidified in my head. Mm-hmm. And then even as I'm writing I'm now into book 2, but like now the magic system has to be really fleshed out for book 2, which meant I've now written like 4 or 5 stories so I can figure out what the magic system is, and the origins of that magic system, so I can have that clear in my head as I write book 2. So
and any of these stories, ones that you've thought about like shortening, tightening, putting or melding into the novel, or they just don't fit?
My original goal was to at the end of each book include 1 or 2 of the short stories. Mm-hmm. But then because like in the early draft of Sweep of Stars, I had which novel? I had one of the one of the novelettes in the back of it. But then book 1 started getting really, really long, and so right. They were like, "Yeah, why don't we not do this and just go straight for just for the book with the glossary and the other charts and everything?" And I'm like, "Okay, that makes sense." But how do y'all feel about a short story collection down the road? And they were like, "We'll cross that bridge."
Right. Now, getting that African Afrofuturist feel, I'm assuming that is not a problem for you. That is something that comes naturally, or is
yeah.
It would probably be, I don't sometimes maybe harder not to do it, right. For because it comes out in all your work in a little bit.
Right. Well, I mean, like a lot of the inspiration for the Astro Black trilogy comes from like I said, with Knights of Breton Court, I was working with a homeless teen ministry. Now I'm doing a lot of community organizing work through a group called the Kepler Institute. And so and that's a very culturally Black space that we organize neighbors with. We do all sorts of different work in the community, everything from networking farms to housing, education, environmental work, work in the arts. So we have all these different tendrils, that we're working with as an organization, and then so I end up modeling a lot of what goes on in the Mungano community on the work that we were doing in Kepra, which challenges the work at Kepra, because then I'm just like, hey, what is it we're working towards? What would our ideal world look like? Mm-hmm. And so you have this tension of the work impacting the art, and then the art impacting the work, and that's that space that I seem to be inhabiting at the moment.
Right. Well, and it's funny because there's probably Le Guin and Spinrad get a lot of attention for writing anarchist science fiction, but there's one part in this book where one of the characters is looking at a map of the Mungano territory lit up, and it says, from the dreaming city to Mars, the mining outpost, no borders per se, not the way old Earth might define them, only communities of alliance. This is what they all fought so hard to forge. They needed a new vocabulary to describe the experiment they embarked upon. Empire wasn't it. A budding cooperation cradled in the Sweep of Stars. So that's kind of like, to me, I always look for mission statements when I do these interviews or I'm with authors, like, what is your mission statement? What are we working for? To me, this was like, that's it. That's it right there.
While you were reading that, I literally got chills. I was like, crap, I wrote that.
Right. Yes, now,
that's it.
That's it. And here's the thing is, I think so far, and I made the mistake sometimes of reading other people's reviews. Like I usually don't do it till after I've written mine.
Mhm.
And I didn't see anybody, I didn't see very many people catching on to the radical, like Afro anarchist element of this cooperative nature of this. And it seems like that comes from that group you're working with, where you're trying to work in an activist style, right?
Right.
And so like this future has a very activist feel. Like you can feel these elements, like as somebody who's done activist organizing where everyone tries to do cooperative consensus-based organizing, you can see it here. And one of the things that's great, if you look at Cadwell Turnbull, or just like there's a lot of Afrofuturist, African diaspora writers who are hitting these in science fictional spaces right now. And it's so important, such an important part of Sweep Stars. I really thumbs up.
Thank you.
That was, to me, that was a mission statement. I don't know if you have anything you want to go into that.
No, it just no. You're right. I mean, it feels very intentional. It feels like there's an activist and anarchist spirit to it, and yeah, it's radical in a lot of ways. But I mean, a lot of the radicalism of it is, just us valuing each other as humans, and the fact that that can be seen as so radical, kind of is its own critique of where we find ourselves these days.
Now, and this one is a little bit of a spoiler, but again, I people can skip ahead if they want to, or again, I think you should have read this book by to get to this part of this discussion. But the Hellfighters, the soldiers, they were the original intention, these characters. So when they like shoot ahead and like become like pirates and do that whole thing, like that's a big deal for this story and this narrative, is they make that decision to do that. But knowing that they were kind of the inciting thing of the story, it's funny to me because they are like one spine of it,
right?
But a huge part of the world building that makes it what it is with them, because they were the ones that had that, like the keeper of the belt. And like that whole scene where like they have Notorious B.I.G.'s belt, right? And these are like the jazz powered starship. These are the elements where you have these characters being the ones that want to connect to Black culture on old Earth. And so that's an important element, because I know it seems like a silly, like kind of like a gag, the keepers of the belt thing, but to me, like that was a very important part of grounding that there are people who remember old Earth, that remember, and it's a very important part of it, because these characters don't want to forget the struggle that the African diaspora had before they were able to have their own separate culture. So to me, that was a really important part, not just a gag.
No, it's very much so. So I mean, and they are the Hova Hellfighters. Hova being, it's a Jay-Z reference. A lot of their personal rifles are named after hip hop figures, or references to hip hop figures. Their command structure is referencing hip hop figures. And the Keepers of the Belt is one of the religious factions in the community, but there's also a cult of Tupac that's actually mentioned in one of the short stories. So that's their
Tupac, right.
So yeah, on one level, yeah, it's fun, and I'm being goofy, and I'm just revealing, I'm just reveling in my hip hop nerdom. But on the other hand, yeah, I'm very much grounding this in a very specific culture in a very specific way.
It is one of the most important scenes of world building that's there, and I can tell that there's more to it in the short stories, like just from what I read. But the other thing, and this is true every time I cover a book, a lot of times I like to find those scenes where I'm like, I saw what you did, I know what you're doing, I really like it, and I know some people might have glossed over it, but to me, that beyond just being like a fun exchange in the book and a funny part, and yes, it was funny, it did make me laugh, but at the same time, I think you're doing something important. And what I really love is when you can balance a scene that's amusing and funny and also poignant and make an important point, because the fact that there's people who like refuse to ignore like the struggles that we're actually living through right now. And it's really interesting because I just visited Portland, and being that I live in San Diego, like we had protests after George Floyd and that whole thing, but that city, like you talk to people, anyone in Portland, and they'll say, oh, everything changed after George Floyd. George Floyd had a huge impact on that whole city because the whole city erupted like everywhere. And it was interesting to me because that didn't happen where I live, right? And because I was reading this book, and that scene of like, well, I don't want to forget about that, that was fresh in my mind when I kept having those discussions because I was reading this book, Anyways, just I wanted to give you an interesting experience of my experience of reading Sweet Stars. And I don't want to take too much more of your time. I know you're a busy guy.
No problem.
But a few other things with Sweep of Stars that, yes, you made Indianapolis the capital of the new future UN. I'm sure you were just having fun with that. But as somebody from Indiana, that gave me a little smile too.
Well, part of that was, so someone said, but when the book deal got announced, because they've seen my track record, they know that most of my books are in Indianapolis. They center in Indianapolis. I mean, Pimp My Airship is basically a historical reimagining of Indianapolis.
I see. They challenged you to get Indianapolis into it.
Right. They were like, how are you going to do that? And I'm like, oh, challenge accepted. And then when I was thinking through this, and I was just like, well, wait a second. We got an ecological disaster. The city of Indianapolis is actually the exact same layout as DC. That was very intentional. And so it made sense in my head then that if DC went away, the new capital could very easily shift to Indianapolis, because
right in the center of the country,
exact same layout. And like, oh yes, this makes perfect sense to me. And then now capital of the planet. So yes, we'll just go with that.
Okay, now, and the other thing about like putting your personality into this, so the patriarch of the family, and I was going with Zola as
that's what I go with. Yep.
Yeah, which is cool because my mother's name was Zola actually, but Zola.
Okay.
That was the pronunciation I was going with. But here's this guy who's kind of a goofball, likes annoying his family, but serious when he needs to be, and all those things. It was funny. That was the scene where I was reading it, and I was like, "Oh, this sounds like Maurice." And I had to say to my wife said, "You've only hung out with him once," and I said, "Yeah, but I also watched him annoy his sons,
right,
in a really fun way, like on that one day."
And the crazy part is and this is actually a weird reflection now that you point this out, is Zola's actually based on another friend of mine. And he and I and he's actually one of the co-founders of the Kepler Institute. But he and I get together every Saturday for coffee. And as we get together, and oh man, the fact that we are that alike is actually more disturbing than I want to think about right now. But we would get together on Saturday mornings, and like our whole yes, we have all this community work we're doing, but our Saturday mornings were just dedicated to us being Black nerds and arguing about whatever came to mind, like how would AI function in community, or these sort of things. And so yeah, that so now sorry, now I'm stuck here going, man, we are so alike. Oh, it could be why we like spending so much time together like we do. And because there's another character that someone else pointed out to me today, because they were just like, hey, is this you? And because I haven't, a lot of times I kind of intentionally put myself into my stories, but like with Pimp My Airship and with Sweep of Stars, I'm like, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to let the characters flow from where they flow. And then someone pointed out, yeah, but Sophie Jefferson and Pimp My Airship, that is you. And then someone came back with Sweep of Stars, said the Bayard character, the guy who's thinking through what his faith means, who's thinking through Christianity through the lens of the diaspora and what that historical lens and the struggles within his faith. That sounds awfully familiar. And I'm just like, well, I don't know.
All right,
I don't know.
Yeah, well, that's the thing is I think we're all in every page that we write
Right.
to a certain
I
degree.
think you're absolutely right. You were absolutely right.
But, and I don't know, I think too, part of it is that,
and I could be in denial also. There's also that that piece.
Well, and the other thing too is that you've been a part of this community, and by doing MoCon and by doing things, and you know, I've listened to you on podcasts too, so I know a little bit about your personality beyond just the time we hung out. But
right.
But I think one of the, I really do enjoy that aspect of your books, that you put your personality so heavy into it, because some writers are afraid to do that, and you know, I think it's one of the strengths. So here's the last like real thing that I want to drill down on a little bit with Sweep of Stars is once you had this kind of setup that you're mapping a trilogy, you're doing these things, and one of the things I thought to myself when I read it is and I have a problem when I read other people's reviews, because obviously sometimes I think like a writer, and I know you're saving things and you're building things up for further books, and sometimes people who are just readers aren't thinking of these things, but I'm thinking ahead, and I see somewhat of where you're going with this, but obviously building a trilogy, like, you must be extremely excited about where you're going. Now, you said you've turned in book 2, you're reworking it now.
Mm-hmm.
How give us a little tease of, without getting into story or ruining it, give us where we're going with this series. So, and obviously you're saying you have short stories, you could go beyond this trilogy.
I absolutely could. And so the big theme for book 2 is, at the end of Sweep of Stars, a lot of the characters find themselves in very different places by the end of the book. And so the theme for book 2 is, how do we carry the spirit of Muungano with us no matter where we find ourselves? And then how do we create it wherever we are? So that's the big picture theme of book 2. But when you talk about when you talk about, you know, how much do we have planned in advance and how do we map these things out? I was halfway through book 2. So there's again, without doing any spoilers, and we've been really good about non-spoilery stuff, by the way. So we've been really good about that. And so, but there is a murder that happens, or a death that happens in Sweep of Stars. And so halfway through, because the book 2 is called Breath of Oblivion. So halfway through Breath of Oblivion, I call up my assistant and I'm just like, I just figured out who killed so-and-so. And he was just like, wait, you didn't know when you wrote that? And I'm like, no, I just figured I'd figure it out along the way at some point. And I figured it out. And he's like, who is it? And I'm like, well, I'm not going to reveal it until book 3. So you're going to have to really just wait, because I said, but I did sow all the seeds for it in book 1. I figured it out in book 2. I won't reveal it till book 3. So there's a whole lot of stuff. There's a whole lot of moving parts to this. And you're right. And that's the excitement of it for me.
You're right. We did stay away from spoilers for the most part. Well, and that's one of the things that's fun about this book too, is that there is the political space opera. There's the murder mystery. There's all the elements of like a fun trilogy and story, but also I think the strength of this book is it's character driven. It's very in the world building is really incredible. You can tell that you have like thought it out beyond what's on the page, and I think that comes off in every bit of it. Now, one of the things that's really important about the best kind of world building is the best kind of world building to me is done subtle kind of sliding by, and maybe you have to go back and look at things. And that's one of the reasons why I'm willing to ride the wave with world building. And if I have to kind of go back and look at things, so I would suggest to people too that they made it this far and they haven't read the book yet, that just ride that wave. If you want to look at the glossary or the timeline, you can. You don't have to. I didn't look at it a ton. I went without it, and in fact, I'm not even sure I knew the glossary was there until I was part of the way through the book. Here's the other thing too. Another reminder, as I always do, if you don't want to buy the book, request it at your library if they don't already have it. Authors love and need people to go into the libraries and request books. If they don't already have it, it's a good chance they will, since it's a Tor book. And then the other thing too is, even if you buy it, there's nothing to stop you from going into your library and requesting it at the same time. Absolutely. Authors appreciate that. Also, stick a review up. That's always important for the authors, and spread word of mouth. It's really important that people do that. This is a book that I think when there's book 2 and book 3 out, people are, a lot of times science fiction readers want a whole series. So there are people who are going to wait and discover this. And I say, don't do that. Like, go and do it now. And so I'm speaking to you people that wait for books 2 and 3. You know, it's fine. You'll be fine. But anyway, so anything else you want to say in Sweep of Stars? I just wanted to get that out there.
No, it's just,
I saw a great staff pick card at Powell's
nice.
On Hawthorne in Portland. I was super stoked to see that there. I know I sold a copy of Sweep of Stars when we did our live Blade Runner event at Mysterious Galaxies to one of my fellow panelists, because as we were setting up, I was explaining the book, and I watched him walk over and buy a signed copy at Mysterious Galaxy. So we're selling copies, Maurice. We're getting them out there. We're doing.
I love to hear. If I love to hear it.
So close me out here on Sweep of Stars. What else do you want to say about it before we go?
Well, Sweep of Stars, I feel like this is the series I think I was meant to write. So if there was any book that was like definitively a Maurice Broaddus book, I would say Sweep of Stars is it. It's I'm putting my everything into this. Thank you. Yeah, I'm putting my everything into this one. I'm leaving nothing on the table. So this is it.
And well, look, and that's the thing, is I had really high expectations for this book, and they lived up to them and exceeded them. And that mission statement paragraph was one of the things that just hit me, where I was like, damn, he's operating on a level I wasn't ready for and really stoked about. So and this is just the opening of a saga, so we've got a way to go.
Exactly.
So, all right, Maurice, man, you were awesome. This was awesome. I will definitely be looking for when can we expect book 2? Do we have a rough outline of?
I believe we're looking at spring of next year. So
excellent.
We're going to try and keep on that schedule.
Trying to keep on that schedule. And you got a middle grade book 2. Do you have one just come out, or?
Yep, one just came out. Unfadeable just came out, and I am working on yet another standalone middle grade book as we speak.
Awesome, man. You are a hardworking dude and still have a day job, right? So
teaching at the middle school and working at the Kepler Institute.
Yep. Man. Yeah, no wonder you have an assistant to keep all this together.
Yes, it is. So many spinning balls. I need help.
All right. Indianapolis represent. Shout out to all our Hoosiers. I always am excited, and you're breaking the mold, because Kurt Vonnegut said Hoosiers are always doing great stuff. They're just not doing it in Indiana. And you're proving you can still do it in Indiana.
You can still do it here.
You still do it here. Yeah. It's great to talk to you. And folks, check out Sweep of Stars. And I'll keep everybody posted. And as always, thanks for joining Postcards from a Dying World.
Hey man, thanks for having me.